Hey everybody, so today we're going to go over an intro tutorial to Rhino 3D using Rhino 6, and we're going to go over how to produce an architectural massing model and then how to take that model and turn it into a diagram using Rhino's built-in rendering program in combination with Adobe Illustrator. So let's hop into Rhino 6. And when your little intro screen pops up, you can either just let this disappear on its own. I like to come into New and select either a large or small object with units involved. Because we're going to be working on an architectural massing model, I'm going to click Large Objects, Feet, and Inches. And all this really does is set up Rhino to accept more of a large object scale. It sort of just, all it really does is modify your grid plane and your units, so you can pick between feet, inches, feet, meters, whatever you guys need. If you're doing something smaller like a little product, you can do a small objects file. Not a whole lot changes, but it's just a quick, easy way to set up the correct units. So I'll click Large Objects, Feet, and Inches. So let's get into interface first. I'll go through this kind of quickly. There's a lot of tutorials already online that will go over the interface a little bit more specifically. So I'm going to cover just enough to get you guys started on modeling this architectural massing. So by default, you should have 4 viewports: perspective, top, front, and right. You can double click the name in order to maximize that viewport and double click it again to minimize it. These are your kind of modeling views. We'll use perspective more than anything else, and then I'll show you guys how to set up an axonometric viewport for rendering a little later. On the left hand side, you have most of your commands. These are all kind of point and click commands, similar to SketchUp. So you've got lines and curves, surfaces, and 3-dimensional shapes, and then a whole bunch of other things kind of down and below that. We'll go over a couple of these and a little bit more detail, and how to kind of produce geometry pretty quickly and easily. Up at the top, starting at the very top, you've got your menu bar. Most of the stuff here are just repeats of what's down in this toolbar here, but you do have your file and your edit menus where you can do your saving, copying, pasting, that sort of thing. Right below that, you have your command prompt. Alongside of pointing and clicking on commands, you can also type in commands similar to AutoCAD. I would recommend getting used to that and getting familiar with the different type of commands that you can type in, as typing in commands is usually quicker than pointing and clicking, but you'll notice that I'll kind of go back and forth between the two based on the command that I want to perform. Sometimes if it's just one of these front commands here, I'll just click on it real quick. Other ones where you kind of have to dig deeper into the menu or into the icons, I'll be typing instead. Just below that, you have this toolbar here, which are your basic or what's called your standard tools. Again, these are kind of repeats, but you have new, open, save, copy and paste, and then you have your rendering commands that are kind of over here. We'll go over those in a little bit as well. You can change these toolbars or these icons by changing your toolbar layout if you want something that's a little bit more specific depending on the tools you're trying to use. I don't do this all that often. I find that the standard toolbar is the easiest one to work with. You'll also notice that these icons down here will change as you click through some of these. Eventually they'll start to change on you depending on what we're going to be modeling and what you want to be modeling. But again, I usually just stick with standard, as that's where most of the stuff is that you're going to be using is located. And then on the right, some of you may have these already, some of you may not. I like to have my Layers tab open, and I like to have my Object Properties tab open as well. If these are not here, you can just type Layer, and this menu will pop up, and you can also type Properties, and that menu will also pop up. You can click and drag these all you want in order to get them to snap to different locations on your screen. Usually what I do is I bring these out as two individual windows, and then my layers I kind of snap so that this purple box is on top. And then my Properties tab I sort of combine with all of these other ones. So I'll just kind of click and drag that into this little bottom box. And I just keep these two open while I'm modeling. Layers are very similar to AutoCAD. Every object needs to be assigned to a layer. I recommend getting used to layering your objects properly. I usually organize things by material or object type, so either by wood, metal, glass, or by type being, walls, doors, windows, glass, that kind of thing. And then down at the bottom, your properties. Right now you're viewing your viewport properties because we don't have any objects in the scene, but once you place an object in the scene and you click on it, you'll notice this changes to object properties. So we'll get to that in a little bit. And then down at the bottom, all of these check marks are your object snap properties, and this is how you kind of navigate geometry specifically to other parts of geometry. So you can snap to end, near, point, mid, all of these are available. And this can be toggled on and off either by clicking this disable button or by clicking OSnap down here. And then the rest of these little toggle commands are your viewport properties. You can toggle on and off grid snap, which will snap your pieces of geometry to specific points on the grid. I usually leave that off. I think it gets kind of annoying. Ortho and planar I don't really mess around with. I would keep those off. OSnap, again, that's your object snap properties. Smart track we'll get into a little bit later. Gumball, you want this turned on. I'll show you what that is in a minute. And then record history and filter, I don't really use those either, so you can leave those off. So that's the interface, and then next we'll hop into creating some geometry. Okay, so before we hop into creating our first piece of geometry, I just want to go over real quick how to navigate your viewport. So again, you can double click on the name of any one of these viewports to maximize it. So I'm going to double click and maximize my perspective viewport tab. And then let's go over kind of rotating around, panning, and zooming in and out of our model space. So rotate is simply done by holding your right mouse click button. So I'm going to just hold that down, click and drag, and it's going to start to rotate around my modeling space. Okay. Panning is done by holding shift and your right mouse click. So that's going to allow me to sort of pan around my space. And then zooming in and out is just using your middle scroll wheel. So zoom in and out. Okay, so again, it's just right mouse click is rotate, shift right mouse click is pan, and then zoom in and out is your scroll wheel. Okay, so let's get into creating some basic pieces of geometry. For the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to be modeling one of Peter Eisenman's diagrams. I think this is from House 4 or 5. And so there are some certain architectural components that we're going to be paying attention to. There's a couple of volumes, there's some walls with some apertures kind of punched into them, there's sort of a relationship between walls and some columns. So this is the kind of geometry we're going to be producing. When it comes to producing geometry in Rhino, there's a couple different types of geometry that you can produce. There are points, which are single points in space. There are curves, which are, you've got your polylines and your splines. You also have rectangles, arcs. This is, very similar to AutoCAD curve commands. Then you have what are called surfaces, which is sort of a surface that doesn't have any thickness to it when you first create it. These are going to be found under here, and there's a bunch of different ways you can model surfaces, from defining sort of corner points. You can define a surface between planar curves. You can do loft commands, sweep commands, rectangles. But none of these are going to have any thickness to them when you first create your surface. Then the next type of geometry are your solid pieces of geometry. So those are like your cubes, your spheres, cylinders, toruses, tubes, that sort of thing. All of this has sort of a closed volume to it. And then you'll notice a lot of these menu icons have these little triangles down in the bottom right hand corner. You can click those and it'll kind of expand that menu, so you have more options. For the point of this tutorial, we're going to be doing mostly solid modeling. So I'm not going to really get into curves and surfaces for this. We're just going to kind of stick to this icon here. And develop most of our modeling that way. In terms of producing a massing model or an architectural model, this is sort of the quickest route to go in. So that's what we're going to kind of stick with. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on this box icon. And you'll notice up in your command prompt, it's going to ask you to first define the first corner of base. Now I can just click anywhere on my screen or within my modeling space, or if you want to be a little bit more specific, you can type a value up here that will define where the first corner is. That value is done based on your X, Y, and Z coordinates. So you'll notice down in the bottom left I have X, Y, and Z. So X and Y axes are these red and green axes, and then your Z axis is your up axis. So let's say I want to put a point at the dead center of my grid. What I'm going to do is type 0, 0, 0. And that's going to say I want that point at 0, 0, 0 on my X, Y, and Z axes. And you'll notice it sort of snapped my locator point to the center of this grid, and then I'll hit enter, and it's going to lock that corner into 0, 0, 0 on my grid. Now the next thing it's asking me for is the other corner of base or length. So I can either just, again, kind of click out in space anywhere if it doesn't really matter to me how big this cube is, or if I want to be more specific, I can again type a location value on my grid. So if I want this cube to be 10 feet by 10 feet, again, we started this Rhino file in feet and inches. So right now, any unit number that I type up here is going to be in feet. So if I type 10, 10, what that's going to do is create the other corner at the 10, 10 axis point on my grid. So it's going to move 10 units in the X direction and 10 units in the Y direction, and it's going to place that point. So then what I'm going to do is hit enter, and then the last thing it's going to ask me for is a height of my cube. And again, I can click at any point, or I can type in a height. So I'll type in 10 and hit enter, and that's going to create a 10 foot by 10 foot by 10 foot cube with one corner at the 0, 0, 0 point on my modeling space. Probably the first thing you'll notice is that our cube is in wireframe. So what we want to do is switch to shaded view. So I'm going to right click on perspective, and you can switch between wireframe, shaded, rendered, ghosted. I usually only do the first three. These other ones take up a lot of memory on your computer, so I usually stay away from them. So we're going to do most of our modeling in shaded view. Rendered view we'll use for previewing our renderings. Shaded view is what we'll do most of our modeling in. And it should switch it to this kind of gray cube looking object. And so that's sort of the typical way to produce any kind of solid geometry. Come over here, click this arrow. Depending on what kind of geometry you want or need, you can click any one of these, and then your command prompt is going to run through a series of questions that it needs to know in order to produce that shape. And then you'll be left with sort of this resulting piece of geometry. Okay, so the next thing we'll jump into is sort of modifying geometry that you've pulled down onto your modeling space. So we've got this cube here, and we're going to go over a couple different ways of modifying it to be something different. The first way is going to be going over your transform tools. So that's basic translation, so moving things left, right, up and down, rotation, and scaling. Most of those can be done by turning on your gumball. So if I select this object, just left mouse click, you're going to notice that this gumball has popped up. If this isn't showing for anybody, you're going to come down to the bottom here and make sure your gumball is bold and activated. Okay. This is sort of a quick tool for making move, rotate, and scale edits to your geometry. So the three arrows are going to allow me to move this geometry along those axes. Okay. My rotate tools are going to be clicking and dragging along these arcs. Okay. And then my scale tools are going to be clicking and dragging along these boxes. So I can click and drag that box and it's going to scale that inwards. Or I can click and drag the green box and it's going to scale it. And then scale it again. One thing you'll notice is as you modify geometry like this, it becomes a little bit more difficult to rotate around, especially if you're going to be kind of zooming in and out and all that kind of thing. If it becomes very hard to sort of rotate around your object, meaning it's like flying off the screen on you, and it's kind of hard to navigate your space, what you can do is do a zoom selected command. So I'm going to type ZS while my object is selected and hit enter. And what that's going to do is zoom selected on that object, so I can now locally rotate around it. Just makes things a little bit easier. I'm just going to undo all of those commands real quick. So Control Z and kind of reset our box. And then the last thing I'm going to show you guys with the gumball is how to sort of change the orientation of the gumball in relationship to the piece of geometry that it's selected. So what you're going to notice if I like move this over, up, and then I start to rotate this cube. Okay, that gumball is going to rotate with it so that I can still drag along sort of a perpendicular axis to the orientation of this cube, right? So notice that the arrows have now rotated with the cube. You may not always want that to happen. This cube may end up in some kind of oddly rotated position. And if you want to move it kind of left and right, it's really difficult to move it directly along our axes now, right? I can't move it straight up or directly to the right or to the left, or directly along my x-axis and directly along my y-axis. But what you can do is sort of reset your gumball. So if I select an object and I type gumball alignment and hit enter, I can reset the alignment. So right now it's set to object, but I can also set it to world. Okay, and you'll notice that the gumball has now kind of realigned itself with the axes of my modeling space. Okay, so now I can drag it directly up, outward, or along the x-axis. I can also set it to object, which is going to set it back to being oriented with the cube. Okay, just kind of moved it down to this edge. Or you can do C-plane, which is going to be similar to world. I'm not going to really get into what that is. You can have multiple C-planes in a modeling space. But really it's just object and world is how you kind of change the orientation of your gumball per the object and the way you've kind of rotated it. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of reset this. And then I'll leave the gumball on object mode for now. Okay. The next kind of edit tool we're going to get into is sort of moving edges or moving faces individually on this cube. So if I want to have sort of like a tapered effect, let's say I want to take this edge and sort of move it along my geometry, what I can do is type move edge and hit enter. And it's going to ask me to select the edges I want to move. So I'm going to select this edge. They'll turn yellow. Say hit enter when done. So I'll hit enter. And then it's going to ask the point from which I'm moving this object from. So I'm actually going to click the top or bottom of this edge. And if your kind of selection marker or your selection tool isn't snapping to the end of your geometry or to the corner like this, you want to make sure your O snap is activated so that this is bold, and then that the corresponding snap location is checked. So end is snapping to the end of an edge or a curve. Near is snapping along an edge or a curve. Point is a point. We don't really have any of those in our scenes, but you can snap to points. Mid is the midpoint of any edge or curve. So if I snap close to the center of this edge, you're going to see it's going to snap and call this mid. Center is the center of any object. Cubes don't really provide you with a center, but if you had like a sphere or a circle curve, it would snap to the center. Intersect is the intersection between two curves or two pieces of geometry, two edges. Perpendicular is if you want to draw something perpendicular to a face or an edge. Tangent are like two tangent curves. And then, the rest I don't really use. Knots, that's specific to a certain type of surface. Same with quads, and then vertices are specific to meshes, which we're not really modeling with right now. So those are all your snap options. So what I'm going to do is kind of snap to the end of this edge. And once I do that, it's going to ask the 2 point that I want to move to. So I can relocate where this edge is in space. And what I'm going to do is all I want to do is kind of move that inwards, so I get kind of an interesting tapering effect. Okay, so I'm going to just snap it so it says near along this edge. I'm going to click and hit enter, and it's going to move that edge inwards. I can really do that with any one of these edges. I can type move edge, select an edge, hit enter, and then click and then relocate that edge. Okay. Right mouse click will also act as your enter key, and it can also act as your repeat command key. So I'm going to right click again to reactivate my move edge command. So it's going to activate the command you last did, and then I'll select the edge, hit right click, so it enters, and I've selected that edge, and then I'm going to pull this edge downward. Okay, so that's one way of editing geometry, is selecting edges and moving them. Another way is to move around the face of a geometry. So I can type move face, and I can select this piece of geometry, and it's going to select the face of that geometry. I'll hit enter, and then again I'm just going to like click a start point and then click an end point. Now it's really letting me kind of like move this anywhere I want. I can also hold down shift, and it's going to confine that movement to straight along one of my axis points. So I can hold down shift and drag it along the y axis, or hold down shift and drag it along the x axis. Okay, and then click enter, and that's going to move that face outward. Now let's say I wanted to move a face upward, so I'm going to type move face, hit enter, select that face, and hit enter. If I click this sort of top edge as my starting point to move from, you're going to notice that it won't ever really let me move that face upwards. What it's doing is it's forcing that face to move down to the grid plane, and that's because by default Rhino snaps your cursor to your grid plane. Okay, so there's not really a good way for me to move this face directly upward. If I want to do that, what I have to do is sort of define a curve to move that face along. So what I'm going to do is escape out of that command. I'm going to type line and hit enter. And I'm going to come up to these options on my command prompt for the start of this line, and I'm going to click vertical. Okay, and then I'm going to click that line, or snap the start of that line to the corner of this piece of geometry, and then drag it upwards, and then click again, and it's going to produce that vertical line for me. Now when I type the move face command, I'm going to select that face, hit enter, and now I'm going to select the bottom of that line, and then that's going to allow me to move that face up and down or vertically along that line, so I can then click at the end of that line, and it's going to move that face upwards. Okay, so those are two different ways of modifying geometry: A, moving edges, and B, moving faces. I'm just going to undo all of those edits real quick to kind of get us back to our base cube. Okay, so now that we've kind of run through those very basic editing or geometry manipulation commands, let's start producing some of the pieces of geometry that are found within this shape. So to kind of start off with, I'm going to create a single wall that represents this guy here. I'll create a second wall that represents this sort of moment of intersection between the two. And then I'm going to create 2 or 3 different cubes that represent these 3 different volumes. Okay, and that'll form the base of this model, and then we'll dive into kind of producing the apertures and all of the smaller little details that you see here. Okay, so we've got sort of a base cube, so I'm going to set one of those kind of, I'm going to drag this sort of off to the side, and that's going to produce that kind of back cube over there. And you'll notice that cube has a little bit more height to it than it does width. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of scale this thing up just a little bit. Okay, so that's going to serve as that. The next piece of geometry I'm going to create is the plane that represents this sort of wall here. Okay, so I'm going to take this cube, select it. I'm just going to copy, click once, and then copy, click again, and that cube will make a duplicate of itself. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to modify this cube so that it looks like that plane. So I'm just going to click and drag on my scale to make this much thinner. I do something like that. And then I'm going to click and drag on that scale toggle to make it quite a bit wider. And then I'll just kind of position this plane so that it looks like it aligns correctly. And so in this image, it looks like that plane sits a little bit higher than the top of that cube. So I'll just take this plane and kind of push it up a little bit. Okay. And then let's create this sort of perpendicular plane that occurs. And you'll notice these are kind of get broken up into a couple of different planes, but right now I'm just focused on sort of the overall shape. So I'm going to make a single plane here and then a single plane here, and then we'll start to break things down afterwards. So I'm just going to copy this. So again, I'll select it, copy, hit enter, click once to determine where you're copying this plane from, and then click a second time to place it. You can hold shift if you want to constrain it in a certain direction. I don't really need to, so I'm just going to click it at any spot. And then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. So I'm going to click and drag on this blue arc, and then I'll hold shift because that will allow me to snap that rotation value to 90, 180, 270 degrees. So I'll just rotate it 90 degrees. And then these two planes sort of intersect at one moment. So what I'm going to do is just kind of pull this over. And then it also looks like one plane is slightly lower than the other one. So I'm going to pull this plane down some. And so it looks something like that. And then it looks like these two objects are kind of intersecting. So I'm just going to take this plane and move it outwards so that they're separate. Okay. Then I might just kind of scale this down a little bit. And then scale this out some. So that plane's just a little bit bigger. Okay. And then the last pieces of geometry I'm going to create are these two volumes over here. Now there's some ambiguity here. So, I don't know if this volume is a single volume or if it's split in two, or if this is one volume and then that's a volume below it. So I'm just going to interpret this as being a single cube here and then a second cube down below. So I'm just going to take this cube, I'm going to copy it, kind of set it over into this other corner here. And then I'm going to type move face, select this bottom face, hit enter, and then I'm going to click on one of the corners and kind of move that face along this vertical edge, so I'm moving it vertically. And then hit enter, and it's going to kind of snap that cube up. And that looks like it's a little small, so I'm going to type move face again, hit enter, click that face, I'm going to move it down a little bit. Something like that. And then I've got that third cube to make down at the bottom. So I'm going to type copy, hit enter, and then I'm going to click this point and then copy it straight down by selecting the point that's directly below it. So now I've got that second cube. And then that cube looks like it has sort of an undercut to it, right? The face of that cube doesn't align with the face of the upper cube. So I'm going to type move face, select the front face of that bottom cube, click the corner and just kind of slide that inwards to produce that sort of effect. And then I'm going to create just a little gap between the two so that I remember that these are two separate pieces of geometry. Okay. So now I've got like these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different pieces to sort of start this model from. And it also looks like, you know, one of these, sort of the plane that I've got in this direction looks a little long right now, like this face doesn't actually stick way out there. So I'm going to type move face, select this end face, hit enter, and then I'm going to kind of click and drag that face back along its edge. So that's a little bit shorter. Okay. And now I've kind of got that face this sort of setup. Now when you're 3D modeling, you want to work iteratively. You never want to always work on the same piece of geometry. That way you always have something to come back to. In case you make a lot of edits and then you decide that you don't want any of those edits involved, like it just wasn't the direction that you're going in. So before I edit this object further, I'm just going to select the whole thing, click and drag. I'm going to do copy, hit enter, and then I'm going to make a second copy of this sort of out further along. Okay, so this will always stay as it is, and then when I go to make the next couple series of edits, I'm going to make the edits to this model, and then we're going to copy and paste it each time we make a new set of changes to our object. And what we'll be left with are sort of like a series of 9 models where each model gets progressively more detailed over time as we make more and more edits to those models. Okay, so let's kind of run through the second layer of editing we're going to do to this model to bring out some of the more refined details that are seen within this image. So we're going to go through sort of 2 operations here. The first operation is going to be sort of splitting these larger cubes into 2 separate cubes. And then the second operation is going to be sort of punching holes into these sort of planar faces to kind of achieve these apertures that you're seeing here. So let's work on that. In order to perform these kinds of edits, what we're going to be working with are called our Boolean operation commands. And these are commands specific to solid pieces of geometry, which is one of the reasons I prefer to model this way. It allows you to kind of union volumes together. It allows you to sort of carve volume from another piece of geometry. There's a whole, there's like 2 to 3 operations that we're going to kind of go through that allows you to do things like that. So the first operation is going to be kind of splitting this cube in half. So it becomes 2 different cubes like we see here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to take this plane and I'm going to copy it. Okay, and I'm going to like kind of push it to what seems to be about the center of this cube in particular. Okay, now if I wanted to get this plane to be directly in the center, I can type move. Shortcut for move is M, so I'm just going to hit M and do enter. And then I'm going to select the center point or the midpoint of this edge, and I'm going to move it to the midpoint of the edge of this cube. Okay, and now I know that this plane is centered directly on this cube. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of pull this out a little bit and pull this out a little bit. The idea being is you never really want to have 2 pieces of geometry with faces that are right on top of each other. You'll notice there's this kind of glitching effect. Okay, that's poor modeling technique. So what you really want to have happen is for this geometry to be fully intersecting this cube. So I'm just going to drag it out a little bit and drag it out a little bit. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to subtract this volume from this volume, and it's going to split this cube into two pieces with a gap down the middle. Okay, we're going to use what's called a Boolean difference command. So I'm going to type Boolean difference, and it's going to ask to select surfaces or polysurfaces to subtract from. So I'm going to select this cube because I'm subtracting from this cube. I'm going to press enter to continue, and then it's going to say select surfaces or polysurfaces to subtract with. So I'm going to select the volume that I'm subtracting with, which is this plane. You're also going to see this delete input. You want to make sure that says no, so you can click it to toggle it. So I'm going to click it so that it says delete input no, and then I'm going to hit enter. And what you're going to notice is that this cube has now been split into two pieces. I can select each one, and you can take this plane and kind of move it out, and you'll notice what it did is it actually just subtracted this plane from that cube, and because this plane intersected that cube completely, it just cut it right in half. Okay, whereas if this plane, let's say we do the same operation to this cube here, so I'll do a Boolean difference here, select this surface, hit enter, select this one, hit enter. Okay, if that plane doesn't intersect the cube completely, it's going to create more of like a channel. Okay, I'm just going to undo that and then move this plane out of the way. Okay, so we've just kind of cut this cube into two different pieces. Okay, so what we'll do next is cut the bottom cube in half. So what I'm going to do is take this plane and just kind of slide it over and then slide it down. And again, I'm just going to make sure that this plane or this wall intersects this cube completely, so it kind of sticks out on all four sides of that cube, right? So it sticks out over here, up at the top, bottom, and on the left-hand side. So I'll select that, type my Boolean difference, hit enter, and then I'll select this object, hit enter, and it's gonna again cut that object in half for me. Okay. So then let's work on this cube here, but I want to try something a little different. If we go back to our image, it appears that these cubes have been cut in half completely, but it also looks like, again, it's kind of ambiguous, but let's say I want to create kind of a channel that runs all the way around the cube but doesn't actually cut it in half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this plane again that I've been using to sort of cut all of these objects with. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, hold shift while I'm rotating, so it snaps to 90 degrees. And I'm going to pull it over, pull it up, and just kind of intersect, not all the way, but just a little bit. And then I'm going to scale this out, so again it intersects through the top and bottom. And what you can do, again, I kind of want this to cut along the center of this cube, so I'm going to type move, and I'm going to snap it to the midpoint of the edge of this cube. So I'll snap it there, and then I'm going to move it up a little bit. Now let's say I want that channel to have a certain depth to it. Okay, I'm going to take this, I'm going to type move, I'm going to click anywhere on this edge. Okay, and what I can do is I can type in a specific distance for this object to move along its edge. Okay, you'll notice that as I drag it along here, this number down here is going to change, and that number is representing how far along the edge I'm moving this object. So I can come in and let's say I want this channel to be 1 foot deep. So I'm going to type 1 foot and hit enter, and now it's going to snap to 1 foot along that edge. And so I'm going to kind of hover over that edge so it's shown as moving along the edge and click. And so that object just moved in 1 foot. Okay. And what I'm going to do is create a Boolean difference command out of this. So I'll type Boolean difference, hit enter, select my first object, hit enter, select my second object, hit enter. Okay, and now when I pull this wall away, it's going to have a little bit of a channel. Okay, so I'm going to do that around the whole object. So I'll take this, type move, I'm going to grab its center point, then I'm going to snap it to the center point of this object, and then I want this to move down 1 foot, so I create that 1 foot deep channel. So I'm going to type move. I'm going to click anywhere along this edge. Okay, and this is going to allow me to move it up and down because I can drag along the vertical edge. I'm going to type 1 foot and hit enter, and that'll snap it to 1 foot, and then I'll just align it to the edge and click, and that'll move that 1 foot deep. Okay, and then what I can do is type my Boolean difference command, select this, enter that, enter, and then that's going to create the channel along the top. Okay, and then I can go and do that to the other two faces. I'll type move, grab the midpoint, snap it to the bottom, type move again, grab along the edge, type 1 foot, hit enter, I'll snap it at 1 foot, and then type Boolean difference, select the first object, second object, and carve that out. Okay, and then I've got to do the last edge. So I'll type move, grab the midpoint, move it to that midpoint, so everything aligns. I'm just going to drag this up vertically so it intersects top and bottom. I'll type move, grab this edge, type 1 foot, snap it to the direction of that edge, click, and now that's 1 foot deep into this object, and I'll do my Boolean difference command. Select the first object, second object, and hit enter. Okay, so now I've created sort of a 1 foot deep channel that runs along the center of this cube. Okay, it's just a different aesthetic, a different way of thinking about what this diagram might be showing. Okay, one thing you're going to notice, all these kind of grid lines pop up on your cube. These are not edges, these are just kind of a display of a face that's on your object. So what you can do is you can turn those off, just select them, come down to your object properties tab, and under ISO curve density where it says show surface ISO curve, you can uncheck that and those lines will start to go away. I don't like those showing. I think it makes things a little bit too convoluted, so I like to turn things off so that I only see actual edges of my geometry. What you will notice though, that Boolean difference command did leave behind these kind of intermediate edges. That's not really clean, what's called clean geometry, okay? Because the face that sort of wraps around this side of the channel is a planar face, so that edge doesn't really need to be there. And there's a really quick command that you can use to kind of clean up geometry that has a lot of extra edges to it. You can select it and type merge all faces, hit enter, and what that's going to do is remove any excess edges in your geometry. So I'll do that every now and again. I'll just kind of select everything, type merge all faces, hit enter, and it's going to kind of clean up your geometry a little bit. Okay, I don't need this plane anymore, so I'm going to delete this. And then the next thing I'm going to do is sort of resolve this intersection between these two pieces of geometry. Okay, Typically what you don't want to do is let two pieces of geometry intersect one another without kind of resolving how they intersect. You'll notice there's not really an edge or anything here, and that's because Rhino doesn't know how you want these two objects to intersect. For example, there could be a hole in this plane that allows this piece of geometry to pass through. They can notch together. There's a lot of different ways you can go about that. So what we're going to do is kind of create a channel in this face that allows this piece of geometry to sort of slide through. Okay, and we'll use, again, our Boolean difference command to kind of produce that effect. So I'm going to type Boolean difference, hit enter, select this object, hit enter, select this one, hit enter. And now what that's going to do is create that sort of notch that allows this object to pass through. And you'll notice I now have edges along the pieces of geometry where the two kind of meet each other, and that's really what you're looking for. That's a much cleaner piece of geometry, that's a much cleaner intersection. Okay. And then the last thing we're going to do is start to punch holes in these walls. This is a pretty good way to create different kinds of apertures within your geometry. So if we kind of go back to our image here, there's sort of two holes punched here, and then there's a third one punched here, and the hole that's kind of punched in this face extends out past the top, so you get this kind of opening here, and then the same thing kind of happens over here as well. So we're going to try and replicate that effect a little bit. So what I'm going to do is create a box. It's kind of a randomly sized box. And let's say I want the first hole in this face to kind of match the width of this piece right here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this cube, I'm going to move it so that aligns with the corner of that cube. So again, just using my snapping tools. And then I want to match the width. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type scale. I'm going to select scale 1D. Okay, that means I'm going to scale this cube in 1 dimension. I'm going to click the base point. So I'm going to click the point where I align the two pieces. I'm going to click what's called the reference point, which is going to be the other corner of this cube that I'm scaling. And then I'm going to scale that cube back so that it matches the width of this piece of geometry. Okay. And so now I know that that aligns. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this cube forward, pull it down, and then I want to match the height of these two objects. Okay. So I'm going to select this object, I'm going to type move. And then up at the top where it says vertical, I'm going to click that so it says yes. And then I'm going to select the top corner of one of this cube. And now that's going to constrain me to moving it in the vertical, or in the z-axis. And I'm going to hover over one of the top corners of this piece of geometry, and it's going to snap it or align it, okay, so that the two tops are at the same point. And then you'll notice that this is kind of extending down beyond the bottom of this plane. I don't really want that. I want it to be kind of like a punched opening. So I'm going to select this object, type scale. I'm going to click scale 1D. I don't want the top face to move, so I'm going to select a point at the top, and then my reference point is going to be the bottom of this shape. Click that, and I'm going to scale this up so that the bottom is above the bottom face of this plane. Okay. And then I want to make sure that this object is completely intersecting this object. Okay, and then I'll run my Boolean difference command. So I'll select this, hit enter, select this, hit enter. And then I can push this cube out of the way. And now what we've got is a punched opening, and we're starting to create relationships between two pieces of geometry because the punched opening in this plane matches the height and width of this kind of protruded piece of geometry right here. So then the next thing we'll do is kind of create this larger opening here. And it kind of looks like that opening extends out beyond this plane or runs pretty close to the edge of that plane. So what we're going to do is take this cube, I'm going to move it so that it kind of aligns with that opening, and then I'm going to click and drag it to the left so I have sort of a column in between the two openings. And then I'm going to do a scale 1D and scale this piece of geometry out to the intersection point between these two planes. Okay, and then I'm going to make sure that this cube is fully intersecting that plane, and then run my Boolean difference command. Okay, and then I'm going to pull this out. Okay, now if I take this object and I kind of move it away so you can see what happens, what it's done is it's kind of created sort of a different kind of notching effect where it's sort of combined the opening we've produced here with the opening we produced for the notch, so you get this sort of gap that occurs, and that's okay. I'm going to leave that the way it is. Undo to bring that back. Okay, so I've just created sort of two apertures in this plane, and then let's create one in this plane here. So I'm going to take this cube, I'm going to kind of rotate it, pull it over, I'm going to intersect it, and now if we go back to our image, that cube, there's sort of two openings with this kind of column condition in the middle, but both of these openings kind of protrude through the top of that piece of geometry. So I'm going to take this, and I'm actually just going to pull the scale tool down a little bit. I'm going to make this a little bit thinner, push it out some, and run our Boolean difference command. Select that object, hit enter. And that's going to cut out through the top because this object is higher than the top face of that plane. I'm then going to move this over. I want this to be about a cube so that this column that I'm creating is about the same width that it is in thickness. I'm just going to kind of eyeball that. And then I'm going to scale this piece of geometry out a little further. I'm actually going to snap it to the plane that's intersecting so that that face and that face align. Okay, and I'll run my Boolean difference command again. And then if I move this object out of the way, you'll start to see the effect that that's created. So now the opening that I just created here aligns with the face as it runs past. So this face here, the right face of this opening is flush with the face of this intersecting plane. Now if you don't want that, if you want to have kind of a little jog here where this kind of looks like as though it's protruding through the geometry, I can type move face, hit enter, select that face, and kind of move it along the edge, and that'll drag that face further outwards. And I kind of like that better, so I'm going to leave it there. And then the last sort of opening that occurs in these planes is this guy over here. It actually kind of looks like there's two, so we can produce that effect. So what I'm going to do is move this piece of geometry over here, move it vertically so that it aligns with the bottom of this piece. And then the goal that I'm trying to create here is that the opening in this plane aligns with the width of these two pieces of geometry. So I'm going to take this object, scale 1D, and scale the width so that it matches. And then I'm going to copy this over to this piece of geometry. So now that I've got two of them, I can subtract both of these pieces from this plane to create those apertures. So I'm going to do my Boolean difference, select the plane because I'm subtracting from it, hit enter, and then I'll select both of these pieces of geometry because I want to produce both of those openings, and I'll hit enter. And then I can move these off to the side. And so now what I've created is sort of a relationship between this opening, that opening, and then these two pieces of geometry. And then the width of this column in the middle matches the width of the gap between these two rectangular volumes. And a lot of that kind of alignment, those alignment techniques, help create some interesting relationships between all of these pieces of geometry. So it doesn't feel so random when things start to come together. So you can pay attention to those kinds of relationships while you're modeling your geometry. Okay, so we've made those kind of first couple of edits. I'm going to delete these two pieces of geometry. I don't really need them anymore. So again, working iteratively, I'm going to copy and paste this one to our next iteration. And so we can start working through kind of some of the finer details that are in this photo. So let's kind of look at this sort of effect here where sort of an area around one of the openings or in this skin has been kind of like carved out. So like half the wall at this spot has been sort of taken out, right? Same thing with these up here. So let's kind of cut these out. So you get this kind of effect where it looks like there's like a notch or something like that. And again, that's going to be done using our Boolean difference command. So I'm going to take this guy. I'm just going to kind of copy it over. And then I want to subtract out like half of the thickness of this wall. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to move it over so it intersects about half. I'm going to then move it over this way so it intersects that as well. I'm going to do a scale 1D. Click that corner, click this corner, and kind of drag it out. And I can even come to like the halfway point, so I have something to align to. And then I'm going to scale 1D again, so I'm going to grab that corner and that corner. I'm going to kind of pull it down, but I'm not going to go all the way through the geometry. And then I'm going to create a Boolean difference command here. And subtract that out. So now I've got this kind of area of this plane that's sort of been half subtracted out, which sort of mimics this kind of moment here. Now you see that kind of got pulled, this edge is sort of pulled all the way over, so it almost looks like a square column. So we can actually do that. We'll just type move face, select that, and just kind of drag it over. I'm going to hold down shift so it snaps along that edge, and I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and click there. Okay, and then we can kind of see where this edge stops as well. Kind of carries over to about the center of that center post. So I'm actually just going to take a move face command, select this, hit enter, grab the corner, and align it back over that way. Okay, so that just kind of carved out that edge. And then the next thing we can do is come over to the other plane. And it looks like these were kind of done from the back side on these two, and then from one side, the other side on these two. So let's create these two notches first. So again, I'm just going to stick with this piece of geometry. And kind of first, I'm just going to snap it so I know it aligns. And then I'm going to push it in halfway, so I'll align it to the midpoint. And then kind of pull this down. And if we go back to our image, there's sort of a long one and then a shorter one. So I'm going to scale 1D this object out so it's nice and long. I'm going to scale it one dimension in the other direction just to pull it inwards to get that little notch looking there. And then the depth of this notch comes down to about the top of the plane that's intersecting it. So then I'm going to scale 1D in the up or in the vertical or Z direction and just align this to the top of that. Okay, and then I'm going to copy this to the left. So I'll hold Shift down while I'm copying it so I know it's aligned. And then I might actually move this shape over so like this face aligns with this face. So I'll do a scale 1D, sort of select this back edge, select that corner, and then snap it to that edge. Okay. And then this notch is much shorter. So then I'm going to scale 1D in the other direction and just kind of pull that over. And actually what I'm going to do is, again, I want to start to create sort of relationships between the different parts of this geometry. So I'm going to snap it to the edge of that opening. Okay. So now I can run a Boolean difference command on this plane and subtract these two volumes out. And I'll be left with something like this. Okay, and then one thing we can check is to see where that ends. So you'll notice that the width of that kind of post here looks like it matches the width of that plane. So what I'm going to do is take a move face command, and I'm going to move this over so it aligns with that post. Okay. And then you'll notice my ISO curves, these intermediate edges have popped up on this piece of geometry. So I'm going to select it, go into my properties, and turn off the show ISO curve or show surface ISO curve, just so we can kind of see what that looks like. And then these two notches are also sort of occurring on the flip side, so the back side. So I'm going to take this piece of geometry and move it so that it sits pretty much right there. Okay, so that these two corners align. And then I'm going to move it vertically so that the depth is the same as these two notches on this side. And then what I'm going to do is I'll scale 1D this object so it's a little narrower. So when you look at the image, that one is somewhat narrower than this. And then I'm going to copy this over. Kind of eyeball that. And do another scale 1D to drag this out. and push it there so that that notch is about a square. And then I'll run my Boolean difference command again. So we'll select this, hit enter, select both of these, and hit enter. And then I don't need any of these volumes anymore, so I'll hit delete. Okay. And now I've kind of just created those sort of indented notching effects. Okay. So that's the only change I'm going to make to that iteration. And then we can copy this and move on to our next. Okay, so let's make our next set of edits to this massing model. What you're going to notice is that right now we have sort of one plane in either direction, but if you go back to the image, you're going to see that there's kind of two in each direction, right? You've got this red larger plane here, and then the blue smaller one here, and then you've got a red one going perpendicular, and then there's a second blue one going perpendicular as well. And there's some sort of intersection quality going on amongst these four planes, so we can start to deal with that as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create sort of a new plane in one direction for this first edit. So I'm just going to kind of create a box that is about the same width, so width-wise and length-wise. And this is where Smart Track is going to come in and be helpful. Like right now, if I wanted to make this new box the same length as this plane, I can't really like snap to the edge of this. So what I can do is turn on Smart Track. And what that's going to do is allow me to align myself to the end of this point. So I'm going to kind of hover over, and you'll see that little point turns white. And then when I drag over, it's going to snap to align with the end of this plane. Okay, so then I can click here, and it'll even give me like a little dimension or width. So it'll say 11 3/4 of an inch along the edge of that object. So I can hover over. I'm going to get kind of close to 1 foot, click, and then drag upwards. So I now have a plane that is of a similar size as the original. Okay, and then I kind of want some space in between them. So I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to kind of pull it out a little bit, but not so much that it starts to intersect that face. So I don't really have a lot of room to play with here. One thing we can do is sort of shift everything over if we wanted to. So we can give that a shot and see what happens. Like, so for example, I want this plane to move further away so I can get some more space in between both of those planes, so that gap gets a little bigger. The only problem though is now the notch that I created isn't going to match. So we can resolve that as well. So I'm actually going to take both of these, or all three of these, 4 of them, and pull it out this way some. Then I'm really going to pull this over so I can open myself up and get some more room between all of these layers. Okay, so I don't really want this to be super tight against these. So what I'm going to do is I've got to kind of realign this notch in this piece of geometry to be back in alignment with this plane that we've modified. So an easy thing to do is going to be to isolate these two objects, so all this other stuff is out of the way. So what you can do is select both, type invert, and then type hide, and it's going to invert your selection and then hide the other geometry, so I only have these 2 pieces to deal with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all the faces that create this notch and move it over so it realigns itself with this plane. So I'll type move face, and I'll select that face, the top face, the left face, and then this bottom one, and hit enter. And now I need to pick a point that's going to allow me to align the two faces. So I know if I click this point, that point needs to meet this edge right here. So I can click on this point, drag it over, and align it and snap it to that edge. Okay. Now, what you'll notice is I didn't grab the faces on this side. So this notch here got kind of messed up, right? You don't want this to be like angled and weird and intersecting. Okay. So I'm going to undo, right? And that's how it should look. And so what I'm going to do is when I type move face again, I'll grab those 3 planes, 4 planes that we did before. Okay. Make sure you only have those 4. If you accidentally select a face that you don't want, you can do Control, and that will deselect the face if you hold Control down while selecting. And then I'm also going to grab, this face, or I guess not that face, so I'll deselect that, so just these 2. And let's see if that works out for us. I'm going to grab this point and sort of pull it over so it snaps to that edge. And it looked like that did it, so I didn't screw this up anymore because I grabbed that face and that face as well. Okay. And so now that notch has realigned itself back with this plane that I moved over. So I'll type show and hit enter, kind of bring everything back. Now I've got a little bit more room to play with on this second plane of geometry. If we go back to our image, you'll notice that that plane is sized a little different, so it's a little bit shorter. It looks like it's about the same height, but there's sort of a notch that's sort of taken out of that area. Okay, so I'm going to come in here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to notch this out so it looks like a chunk of this is sort of protruding through the opening of this plane here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is scale 1D. I'm going to align the top of this plane. Okay, if Smart Track starts to get annoying, like it keeps snapping to a bunch of stuff you don't want it to, you can just come over here, click this, and turn that off. Okay, and I'm going to align it to the underside of this opening here. Okay, and then I'm going to scale this up just a little bit. I'm actually going to align it with the bottom of these here. Okay, and then what I want to do is kind of carve out this bottom corner so that it feels like a section of this plane is kind of protruding just through that opening. So again, trying to resolve these intersections. So I'm going to create a new piece of geometry, and I'm going to use this to do a Boolean difference with. So I'm going to take this piece of geometry, I'm going to align it to this top face, and then I'm going to move it over so that it's intersecting that plane fully, right? So it's going to hog out or carve out that sort of bottom corner of that plane. Okay, so I'll type Boolean difference, select this geometry, hit enter, select that one, hit enter, and then I'll delete this. And now that plane sort of comes up and then hooks around the bottom kind of rail of this surface. Okay. So we've just kind of produced that little effect. And then if we go back to our image, it's a pretty solid plane. You know, there's not a lot of detail going on there, so I'm just going to kind of leave it as it is now. Okay. And then, so that'll be the only edit I make to this object. I'm going to copy this over for our next iteration. which is then going to be adding a plane in this direction. Okay, so I'm going to start to work on this plane here that has sort of these 4 spikes that come up, and what you'll notice is it looks like this plane sort of aligns itself with that sort of center column piece that we produced. Okay, so I'm going to create a plane that sort of aligns itself with this center column piece. So I'll grab my cube tool, kind of drag this out, sort of eyeball that, and then let it extend upwards. And then I'll just kind of pull this through so it does something like that. Okay, and again, now we've got some intersections we need to resolve between this and this. So what we'll do is kind of create sort of a notch condition again. So what I'm going to do is scale this down a little bit because I don't want the top of this to align with the top of that when I do this Boolean. So I'll scale 1D, grab the bottom, pull that down a little bit. Okay, then I'm going to type my Boolean difference command and subtract this shape from that one. So I'll select this, hit enter, select this, hit enter, and now it's kind of carved out that moment. So if I just pull this out of the way, I've carved out that channel. Okay, and then the next operation we're going to do is start to create these apertures in that plane. So let's grab a new box, kind of pull this upwards, and then I'm going to create a couple of these to produce, 1, 2, 3 openings in this plane. So I'll move this over, and then I'm going to pull this upwards. I'm actually going to align this, so I'll type move, click vertical, so I toggle that on, and I'll align the bottom of this with the bottom of that plane. And then just make sure that I have about a square column at the end of this thing. And then I'm going to scale 1D so that this opening is the width of, or aligns itself with this column here. So I'll snap to a corner on that. Okay, so that'll be opening number 1. Okay, opening number 2, I'm going to copy this, move it over, give myself a little room for a column, and I'm going to scale this down a little bit so it's not so wide. And then I'll copy it over again for opening number 3. And I'll just try and make sure that the width of this gap is about the same as the width left for this column at the end. So I'm going to scale this guy down a little bit. So I have sort of a square column there. So now I've got these 3 volumes that I'm going to subtract out from. So I'm going to do a Boolean difference, select that plane, hit enter, select these 3 volumes, hit enter, and then I can delete these 3 volumes. And now I've got that plane that's sort of intersecting that object. Okay. Cool. So that's the only edit that I'm going to make to this piece. And then we'll kind of copy this, and we'll get into some of the smaller columns that are produced next. Okay, so the final edit we're going to make to our final iteration is going to be the addition of these sort of columns that sit within some of these planar elements. Okay, in order to do this, rather than subtracting geometry, we're going to start to add geometry. So we're going to switch from a Boolean difference command to a Boolean union command, and that's sort of how you kind of merge two volumes together. So before we start adding the columns, I just want to show you guys what a Boolean union command is going to do. So I'm going to have two volumes kind of offset from one another in all three directions. And so right now, these are two full cubes. And again, that sort of intersection hasn't been resolved yet. Now, a Boolean difference, as we know, is going to carve one volume from the other. Boolean union is going to merge two volumes together and carve out the inside so that they aren't intersecting anymore. So if I select both of these and type Boolean union and hit enter, it's going to union those two volumes together. Okay, and you can kind of tell that when you select it, the wireframe looks as though it's kind of carved out the middle of those two objects. So when I zoom inside of them, it's kind of tough to see, but these two objects have been unioned together. Just to show you what it looks like on the inside, I'm going to explode this and delete a face. So you can start to see that it's actually like deleted the interior faces and created sort of a single void among the two objects. Okay, so that's the command we're going to use to sort of produce these new columns. So if you go back to the image, it looks like there's sort of clustering columns around certain spaces. So what we're going to do is kind of add in a couple columns like around this, and then we'll add columns here, 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 and here. So we'll take sort of our cube command. I'm going to locate a cube. We can start, I suppose, at the midpoint of that edge, and then sort of come off in one direction. Now it's going to be kind of difficult. Like if I want the cube to be the same width of this here, it's going to be a little difficult to make that. So what I'm going to do is sort of just create a random shape first and then modify it later, and then I'm going to just extend it up a little bit. So I want this cube to be the same width as that post. So I'll select it, do my scale 1D, start point, reference point, and then scale it out to match the width. Okay, and then I want this to kind of look more like an extruded cube instead of a rectangle, so I'll scale 1D in this direction and just get that to be more of a cube looking post. Okay, so I'm just going to set that there. Okay, and then it doesn't really extend up beyond the top. They're sort of planar here, so I'm just going to kind of move this downward. Click vertical, and then align it to the top, like that. Okay, and then there's sort of like a cluster of three of them. So I'm going to copy this over to here. And what I would like to see really is, you'll notice in the image, you know, these are about the same size, each one of these three posts. So what I really need to do is kind of move this outward to here, and then figure out how to pull this face back out so that it is the same width. And it looks like I kind of missed a little gap here, so I'm gonna snap that there. Okay, so I need to kind of close this in, and so what I'm gonna do is sort of create a piece of geometry that infills this gap or this hole, and then I'm going to merge it all together through a Boolean union. Okay, I can't move this face because it's going to move all of this along with it. and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to create a box. I'm going to click this corner, and I'm going to click this corner, and it's going to start to infill that piece of geometry. And then I'll align it with the bottom here. And it actually looks like I kind of missed, so I'll delete that and make sure I actually grab the edge and the end and pull it downward so it aligns there. Okay. So now I need to make this and this one piece of geometry. Okay, so I'm going to Boolean union these together. So I'm going to select this and select that, type Boolean union, hit enter, and that's going to create or merge those two pieces together. I still have this edge condition here which I want to get rid of, so I'll select it and do my merge all faces command, and that's going to remove those edges. Okay, so now I've got this kind of triple post condition. All right. So that looks okay. And then the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take these posts and I'm going to align them to these three as well over here. So I'll select this, copy it, set you here, and then I'm going to scale this up a little bit. And now I'd like all of these posts to be roughly the same size. So you'll notice this is a little wider than this one. So I'm just going to type my move face command, select that face, and move that out so it's the same size. And then I'll copy this over to here, do the same thing so that they're the same width. Pull that out, and then do the end as well. Okay, so now I've got those guys there. And what you can do is, if you want to, you can Boolean union each one of these together. So I'll select all of that, Boolean union those, so it's all one piece of geometry now, and then do my merge all faces to get rid of the edges, and then you can select everything and turn off your ISO curves. And now those are kind of one thick column that gets bigger on its way out. Okay. And that'll about do it. You guys can keep kind of moving forward with these. Keep using your Boolean union commands, keep using your Boolean difference commands, and you can just kind of keep modifying solid geometry through those options and really get some pretty complex moments where you're kind of carving geometry out, you're creating notches or posts, channels, all of that kind of stuff. Just remember that you need to be modeling with solid geometry from this sort of menu set on your left here. You can't Boolean union open planes or geometry that doesn't have thickness. It just doesn't work like that. So now that we've got sort of a completed massing model, we'll hop into rendering next. Okay, so now that we have a sort of finalized massing model or series of massing models, we're going to get into rendering and producing diagrams. So to produce a digital diagram, I sort of have my own personal kind of way of overlaying line work with digital imagery and renderings to produce sort of a composited image that has line work, color, shadow, things like that, kind of all rolled into one single image. You'll notice I kind of space these out a lot more just to give us some breathing room. I want to make sure that when I render one of these, only one of them is being viewed, not multiple. So you can space things out just to kind of make sure that's okay. Everything is going to be rendered from an axon point of view. So the first thing we want to do is switch our camera to axon. And in order to do that, make sure nothing's selected. You're going to come down into your properties window, and under viewport, you want to switch projection from perspective to parallel. Okay, and you'll notice that now everything is sort of being viewed as an axon. Okay. And then the next thing we want to do is set up a rendering view for each one of these and save that rendering view. So if this is my first model that I'm going to render, I'm going to zoom in, so I'll select it, hit ZS, and hit enter. It's going to zoom selected. It's going to kind of center that object on the page. Now, I don't want to lose this view. So what I'm going to do is type named view. And that's going to pull up this named view panel. And I'm going to save this and call this axon 1 and hit OK. It's going to save that view for me. All right. And then that means when I kind of move around, so I'm going to just sort of pan to the next object. You don't want to rotate, okay, because that's going to change the angle of the axon you're at. So now that I've rotated, I've sort of lost that view and I can't get it back. So what I'm going to do is type named view again. I'm going to double click on this axon 1 and it's going to jump me back to that view. So I can close this. Now I'm just going to pan over to the next model. Select everything, type ZS and hit enter. It's going to center it. Type named view. Do a save as and call this 2. I'll pan over to the next one. Select it, ZS, hit enter. Named view. Axon 3. And then just kind of go down the line. ZS, enter, named view. Rename that. Axon 4. This will be 5. And this will be 6. Okay. So these are going to be all the rendering views that we take to create sort of our series of diagrams that showcase sort of the evolution of this massing through each iteration. One thing you are going to notice, at this viewpoint, that sort of bottom cube gets lost down here. So I'm going to switch back to my perspective view so I can keep modeling. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this little arrow down over here, go down to active viewport or go to set view and switch this back to my perspective view. And it's going to jump me back. So I'm just going to go to the last model, or I can even go to each one of these models. I'm going to select these, scale 1D, and I'm just going to kind of bring that face out a little bit. Okay, then I'm going to go back to my named views. I'm going to select axon 6 because that's the model I just edited, double click it, and now those two cubes are kind of more in my view, so when I render these, they're not going to get lost anymore. So I'm going to go back to my perspective view, and I'm going to delete sort of each one of these, and then copy and paste the ones that are wider. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to delete them. I'm just going to select them. I'll do a scale 1D. Select my reference points, and then I'm going to align it with the one that I edited. So now all of those have been pulled out. Just kind of do it all at once, nice and quick. Okay. So I've got my objects set, and now I've also got my named views set as well. So I can double click on Axon 1, set to this view, and let's render out a couple images here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to close this, and I'm going to switch my viewport from shaded to render. So again, I'm just going to right click on the viewport name and switch it to rendered. It's going to pop up this kind of like black and white rendering. If you're not seeing this, what you want to do is come over to your rendering tab, scroll down, or you don't even need to scroll down, just click this little reset to defaults button and click yes. And that should give you a rendering view that looks like this. What you're looking at right now is what's called an occlusion render. There's no light source in this, which makes it a very easy rendering to set up, but it creates shadows based on geometry proximity and where geometry sort of intersects itself. So you'll notice that at certain creases or where geometry gets really close together, it creates these shadowed areas or these shadowed moments. And then where geometry is kind of out in the open and far apart, you get that kind of nice white crisp look over here. Okay. One thing I do want to turn off is the ground plane. I don't want these things to have a ground plane to them just yet. So I'm going to uncheck ground plane. It's going to make it feel like it's floating, and that's okay for now. There's just a couple settings we want to set under our rendering tab. First is the resolution and quality. What I'm going to do is pull this down and switch it to custom so that I can edit these, and then instead of pixels I'm going to switch it to inches, and we're going to render these out at 10 by 10. DPI 72 is really low for an image, so I'm going to set this to 150. And then I'm going to change from draft quality to good quality. If you guys want to wait for final quality to finish, you can. I don't think there's going to be much of a difference between good and final quality. It just makes the rendering time a little bit longer, which we don't really want. Okay. Backdrop we'll leave as solid color. Keep that as white. It's fine. The rest of this stuff we're not really going to change. We're just going to render out this really nice kind of occlusion rendering first before we do anything else. So we'll just click the rendering button. And this is going to pop up and it should start rendering out that image. Okay, so it finished rendering, and then we'll click the little save icon up in the top left. And then we'll save it to a location on our desktop. I created this folder called Occlusion Renders. Name this Axon 1. And then you want to make sure you save it as a .png. Don't use JPEG or anything else, because a PNG, the nice thing about it is it doesn't have a background, so all that white space around the model won't actually be there. So if you want to bring it into something like Photoshop and apply a background, you don't need to go in and crop out all of that white space. The background will just kind of fall in place. So that's kind of a nice effect of using PNG. So always save as a PNG file. Click Save. Okay. And now that all those settings are set, all I'm going to do is cycle through all of my named views and render out each iteration. Okay, so we've got all 6 of those occlusions rendered out, so we'll just set those aside for a minute. And then the next thing we're going to get into is producing a rendering that has shadow and a light source to it. So I'm going to switch back to Axon 1. Close this. And then under your render settings, we're going to switch from skylight to a sun. So I'm just going to click this and then unclick skylight. You're going to notice I've got these really dark shadows being produced now. If you want to change where the shadows are coming from, you're going to go under your sun settings. And then under manual control, you'll check that. And we can kind of change altitude. We can change direction, where things are being, where the sun's being located and casting shadows to and from. So I'm going to kind of go with something like, I want to get some good shadows, so I'm going to sort of throw this on this side. So it looks like I'll have a shadow kind of projecting down this way. And then these edges are going to be dark, and everything on the other side is going to be kind of light. So let's render that out and see how that looks. Click OK. Click render. Okay, so I get these kind of stark shadows, and that's okay. It doesn't look very great, but when we overlay things in Illustrator, it'll start to look quite a bit better. So we're just going to leave it like this. We'll save this out. Under desktop, I'm going to create a new folder and call this shadow renderings. And do Axon 1. Okay, and this is why it's important to always use your named views anytime you do a rendering, because you want these two images, the occlusion and the shadow, to align perfectly when we put one on top of the other in Illustrator. If you shift the camera at all, or you pan even so slightly, they're not going to do that. So always make sure you're rendering from the same named view. So I'll just go through and render out each one of these again with the shadows on. Okay, so I rendered out each one of those shadow renders. And then the last rendering we're going to do is start to mess around with some kind of color. So I'm actually going to reset to default. And that'll bring back that occlusion render setting. I'm going to go down and make sure I turn off the ground plane. So we'll get rid of that. And we can start applying some materials to these objects. Right now I'm only going to get into color and sort of basic built-in materials for Rhino. So all of that is going to occur under your materials tab. Right now there are currently no materials in the model, but I'm going to select, let's say, this guy. I'm going to go to create material, and there's a lot you can pick from. Custom gems, that's like if you're doing jewelry. You have glass, metal, paint, picture, plaster, plastic. I'm going to go with metal. Try to stay away from transparent or translucent material, so I wouldn't do glass or gems right now until you get a little bit more familiar with the way these materials work. So I'm going to apply, let's go with a paint material. This is kind of like car paint. And right now by default it doesn't have any color assigned to it. It's sort of that white color, but you can kind of scroll down and select color. And let's say we change it to like a red and click OK. And then we can right click and assign to objects. Okay, and now that's got some color on it. So again, it's create a new material. Once that material is created, you can change the color down below. And then when you want to assign it to an object, you'll select that object, right click on the material, and do assign to objects. Okay, and there's a lot you can change with this. So it's got like matte settings, where if you turn down the glossiness, it'll lose some of its reflection properties. I mean, it depends on what kind of paint or what kind of finish you're looking for, but you can mess around with that. You can also come up and change the type, so if you want to switch it from paint to something else like metal, you can do that as well. And you'll have some other options here. The metal requires like reflections and things like that, which we don't really have in our scene yet. So I'm just going to stick with paint for now, just as a way to kind of add some color, and I'll turn the gloss down a little bit. So I might assign a red color to those, and then I'll create a new paint material. And let's say we do sort of like a bluish color, and then assign to objects. And then let's pick this, and we can assign to objects, and assign to objects. So I might actually take this and make it red instead. Okay, so I've got something like that. And then maybe these two columns get a red paint applied to them as well. So we end up something like this. And again, you want to go through your named views and assign the materials, or you can just kind of switch yourself out to your perspective and come in and update all your colors. So you kind of want to match. You don't really want to change what's being colored. So if that piece and that piece are red, I want to make sure I maintain that. So this and this will get the red color, and then this will get the blue color, and this will get the blue color as well. So then what we're going to do is render out each one of these as our color. Okay, so we've got these materials assigned, and we're going to start kind of rendering things out. I'm going to just make sure my default rendering is reset to its defaults. So I'll click yes, remove the ground plane. We need to then change our video resolution because it reset it as well. So we'll switch this to custom inches, 10 by 10 and 150, and good quality. So now I'm just going to make sure I'm at my named view, and I'm going to click render. This is going to take a little bit longer to render out, but the effects that you get are quite nice when you start to mess around with materials that have reflectivity to them. So you'll start to notice, you start to get reflections between different materials because these now have sort of like a shiny or reflective material applied to them. So I'm going to go through and save out each one of these as our color renderings. And we'll call you Axon 1. Close, go to our next one. Son 6, and then close that. So we have 3 images so far that are sort of creating our final composited image. The last thing we want is to export out the line work for each one of these massing models. So I'll switch myself back to Axon 1. I'm going to switch myself back to shaded view as well. Now the great thing about Rhino is that it's capable of producing the line work for this image based on the geometry that's involved here. So what we're going to do is select everything, type make 2D, hit enter, and then we're going to have this kind of options box that pops up. And so we want to stick with view as our projection, which should be Axon 1. You can pull this down and just make sure that it says Axon 1. And then for object properties, from input objects, that's fine. Tangent edges, you can see a little preview up here of what this does. Tangent edges are really better for curved objects. So if you have those, you can turn them on. If you don't have any curves in your objects, no filleted edges or anything like that, you can turn it off. But I usually just keep it on no matter what. Hidden lines we definitely want turned on. Okay, and then scene silhouette, we also want that on, which is sort of the outline around the outside of your object. And then you can click OK. And then what it does is it produces the line work as a 2D image. So I'm going to switch from Axon 1 to our top view, hit ZS and hit enter. And this is the line work that comes out of that object. So I'm just going to kind of push it up and over. And what's nice is that all of these are, the line types are layered, so our hidden lines are all on one layer. Okay. The curves are all on one layer, and then our scene silhouette is also all on one layer. Okay. I'll usually change this to a red color. And you can also right click on a layer and do select object so you can see what that scene silhouette is. So I'm just going to turn that off real quick. I'm going to turn off the hidden curves real quick and show you one of the things that kind of happens when you don't resolve your intersection. So if I go back to our Axon, remember that we never sort of resolved the intersection between these two objects in our first iteration. Because of that, Rhino didn't draw the lines as to where those two objects intersect. So we're just going to do some really quick cleanup. I'm going to switch to my curves layer under my visible, turn off my hidden layer. I'm going to here. So it likes to group all the objects together, or all of the curves together. So if you need to select an individual curve, you can just select this, type ungroup, and it's going to allow you to select individual curves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this over to here. Then I'm going to type extend and select this curve, hit enter, select that curve. So that extends out and closes that off. And then I'm going to draw a curve that's vertical, straight down, so hold my shift key. And then I'm just going to trim these two curves. And curve editing is very similar to AutoCAD. Okay, trim, extend, all of those types of commands are in here. So I just wanted to kind of close that curve off. And I know, like, through Axon drawing, that this edge should be parallel to that edge, so that's why I just kind of copied and pasted that over there. And then that should be a vertical edge. So I just drew that as a vertical edge, and it's going to intersect wherever it needs to. And then you can turn back on your hidden lines and your scene silhouette. Okay, so that's kind of our first 2D drawing, and we'll just sort of set that off and over to the side. Okay, and then I'm going to go through each of my named views and save out each one of these as make 2D. So I'll type make 2D, make sure all that's selected, click OK, come back to my top view and move that up and over off to the side. And then I'm just going to check, turn off my hidden curves, just make sure all the line work looks okay. Sort of double check everything. And then I can turn my hidden curves back on. And pull it up and over. So again, it's really important that you use those named views, because again, if I'm going to overlay this line work on top of those images, you need to make sure everything aligns. The only way to do that is to make sure that you're rendering and producing the line work from the exact same camera position. So always make sure you're using your named views when producing your renderings and your Make 2D line work. So now I've got all of these kind of rendered out. Okay. What we're going to do is export out each one of these as an Adobe Illustrator file. That way we can bring it into Illustrator. We'll add our images in the background, mess around with the line weights, make sure everything kind of looks nice, and then we'll export our final images from there. So I'm going to select this, just the first one, type export, hit enter. Under my desktop, I'm going to make a new folder, call this line work. Under Save As Type, we're going to scroll all the way to the top and do Adobe Illustrator. File name, Axon 1. Click, make sure we're in our folder, line work, Axon 1, click Save. When the options box show up, right now I'm not going to pull these out as a specific scale. You can if you want to under this preserve model scale, so 1 foot equals 1 inch. You can mess around with that if there's a specific scale you want to do all of your drawings at. For this, I don't really care. So I'm just going to do a snapshot of current view and click OK. And I'll run through each one of these and render them out. Okay. So that's all we need our Rhino file for. So at this point, we're going to close out of Rhino and we'll hop into Adobe Illustrator. Okay, so now that we have all of our images rendered out and we have our line work, we're going to hop into Illustrator. I just kind of want to show you what the final result is going to look like. So this is sort of the final JPEG. It includes, the color rendering, the occlusions, which give you the shadows and sort of the darker areas, and then it includes the shadow rendering. So you have some shadows, and then it has all of the line work sort of put on top of that. So this is sort of the final composited image that we're going to produce. I've already done it for Axon 1. I just want to show you what the Illustrator file kind of looks like for that. So we'll open up the line work file. You'll set your artboard to 10 by 10. And then what we'll do is import each image onto its own layer. So I've got sort of line work on these 3 layers. Turn those off. We've got the color image on a layer. We've got the shadow rendering on a layer, producing that shadow right there. And then we've got the occlusion layer, which I actually have 2 of them because I want them to be a little bit darker than just having the one. So I've got one occlusion, and then I copy and pasted the second occlusion on top just to make it a little darker, and then shadows, color, and then your 3 line types. Okay, and that once you overlay all of those on top of each other, they produce sort of a nice quality diagrammatic image. So we'll go through and produce this for each kind of iteration that we made, and then we'll export it as a final JPEG. So I'm going to close Axon 1, and I'll kind of run through all the steps to produce that using the second Axon. So you guys exported out all of your line work as Illustrator files. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is actually open up the Illustrator file with that line work. So axon 2 is going to be the next one, so I'll just open that guy up. Okay. So depending on what your last artboard settings were, if you do Control minus, it'll zoom out. The last Illustrator file project I did, I set the artboard to be 36 by 36 inches. That's way too big for this diagram. You'll notice you have your layers on the right here. The nice thing is that Illustrator is going to maintain the same layers that were in your Rhino file. So you have your silhouette, your profile line on a layer, your visible curves on a layer, and then your hidden curves on a layer. That makes it really easy to provide line weights to each curve type. First thing we're going to do is set our artboard to be 10 by 10. So I'm going to come over to this icon over here, this artboard tool, click that. It's going to put a dash checkered around the artboard. I'm going to hit enter on my keyboard and change this to 10 by 10. And then click OK. That's going to make that artboard much smaller. The next thing I'm doing, I'm going to click and drag select all of the line work and just kind of push it off to the side for now. We'll deal with that a little bit later. Then what we're going to do is create a new layer. This little icon down here, I'm going to click and drag this layer all the way to the bottom. And then we're going to place our first image, which is the ambient occlusion, onto this layer. So we're going to go to File, Place, go to our desktop, find our ambient occlusion renders, grab axon 2 and click Place, and then just click anywhere on the screen. Now we need to size this up a little bit. So I'm going to put it in the bottom left hand corner, click and drag on this upper toggle, hold shift. This is really important. You want to hold shift so you don't change the proportions or stretch the image in any way. And then snap it to the upper corner. And then you just want to verify up at the top that the image is now 10 by 10. Okay. Then what we're going to do is bring in, or we're just going to copy this image in place. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to do edit, copy, edit, paste in place. And then I'm going to drag that new placed or new copied image onto the next layer. So you can select it, and then this little box that shows up in your layer, just click and drag and drop that onto layer 5. So now I've got an image on layer 5 and on layer 4. Now I want to darken in that occlusion, so I'm going to select the image on layer 5. I'm going to click opacity, and under normal, I'm going to drop that down and click multiply. And you'll see that it just darkened in that occlusion render for me. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is create another new layer and do edit, copy, edit, paste in place. It's going to create a third layer. I'm going to select that image, or that third image, click and drag it up to layer 6, select it. I'm going to go up to opacity and change this back to normal. And then what we're going to do is we're going to replace this image with the shadow rendering. So I'm going to select it. I'm going into where it says axon2.png up here. You'll notice that this references it as a linked file. Click axon 2, and I'm going to do relink. And I'm going to go back out into my shadow renderings, select axon 2, and place that in there. And it's going to update that third image to my shadow rendering. Okay, then what we're going to do is take this shadow rendering and set the overlay type to, let's see, color burn. Let's see, I gotta remember which one to make it. I believe it's overlay. Yep, so we'll do overlay. Just because it kind of hangs on to the shadows produced by the occlusion render, as well as the shadows produced by that shadow rendering. Then if you want to lighten this up a little bit, just because things are getting a little dark in some of these spots, I can set the opacity to 90%. Okay. Then we'll kind of repeat this process. So we'll do create a new layer. We're going to do edit, copy, edit, paste in place. Click and drag that new image up to layer 7. Okay. And then I'm going to click that image, click Axon 2, do relink, go back to my desktop, find in my color renderings Axon 2, and place that. And then we want to change the overlay of this image as well, so it looks a little bit nicer. So we'll set it to normal, and you can just use your scroll wheel and kind of hover through and go through these. I think what we'll end up using is something like hard light. Looks pretty good. Yeah, multiply is okay. Color burn gets a little too grainy, so we're going to use hard light. Kind of keeps pretty good balance between maintaining that occlusion and those shadows, and then bringing in the color as well. Okay. And then you'll also notice, like, sometimes the shadows can get lost a little bit, and if that's the case, you can always duplicate the image. So I might make a new layer in between 6 and 7. I'll turn off layer 7 just so I can select the shadow image and do an edit, copy, edit, paste in place. And that's going to bump up the shadows quite a bit more. You can also set this to normal and start to turn the opacity way down as another way of overlaying shadows if that looks a little better. So you can start to see the difference if I take this, move that up to its new layer, and then I can turn it off and on. So those shadows will get a little bit darker, which is kind of helpful. So it's just about kind of changing with the opacity and the overlay type to see what kind of effects work well. Let me bring this down a little bit more, say like 15. And then we'll turn on our color image again. Okay. So we've got all of our images overlaid properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock all of these layers by clicking and dragging along this second column here. If I just click, it's going to lock that layer, and then I can click and drag, and it's going to lock all of those. I'm going to lock those because I don't want to accidentally move one of those images while I mess around with the line work. So the next thing we're going to do is take this line work, drag it over, select all of it, kind of click and drag it over. I'm going to start to align that top corner, and then the trick now is to scale the line work up so that the line work overlays properly on top of your rendered image. So I'm going to click and drag this up, and then you can use the arrow keys to kind of tap this thing over and into place. It's probably going to be one of the more time-consuming parts of this whole process, is just to make sure that the line work matches your rendering. See, right now it's off a little bit up here. Looks okay down here, but that implies the line work, the size is a little too big. So I'm going to grab this, and you always want to hold down Shift so that you're scaling it proportionally. I'm just going to kind of drop that in there. And that's pretty close. I think it's probably good enough. You might kind of, with the arrow keys, kind of tap that over one. Might look a little better. Get things to line up as they should. I'm going to try and drag this down just a little bit more. You might have to zoom in some to really get it perfect. something like that. Okay, that's good enough. So our line work now matches our drawing. Then what we're going to do is sort of change or modify the line weights so we have proper line weights. Typically your scene, your silhouette, your profile line is going to be your heaviest line weight. So I'm going to set that up here, the stroke, to 3. In order to select everything that's on a layer, you just click this little circle and it will select all the items on that layer. So I'm going to set this to 3. Kind of a nice heavy line weight that works all the way around. I'm going to select the visible curves and make sure that's set to 1 point. And then I'm going to select the hidden curves, and those should be our lightest line weight, so I'm going to make those 0.25. It'll be nice and light, and they sort of fall into the background. That's really all there is to it, to creating sort of a nice rendered composited image or diagram of your model. And then we're going to export this file, export as. We want to export it as a JPEG, so I'm going to make sure that's set to JPEG. I'm going to click Use Artboards. Go back to our desktop. I've set up a new folder called Final JPEGs. I'm going to save this in this folder, and it can be called Axon 2. And click Export. RGB is fine. Make sure your quality is set to maximum. Resolution 300 is fine. And then click OK. Then we'll minimize this. You can come to that folder where we started to place things. And now you've got Axon number 2. Okay. So what you're going to do is just kind of go through and edit and composite each axon into its own final image. Okay.